I think in a geographical context, Australia seems to be more in a place where it will be required to make prolonged transits, especially to get in closer towards the South China Sea or even the East China Sea in those areas, or even the Central Pacific and possibly the Indian Ocean also.
I think Australia uh, made perhaps the right decisions to go nuclear. All of a sudden on 15 September 2021. So as I mentioned somewhere, that announcement was probably more impactful than the Nautilus's signal of underway on nuclear power.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth edition of Development Dialogues. Once again, I'm really delighted to have Admiral Shrikhande as my co-host. And today we're going to do a topic that might be a little dated, but keeps coming up now and again, and that is AUKUS. So let me go back and talk about the Australian submarine deal first. Australia, as we know, has been operating six Collins class. Is it six or eight?
That's right,
Six Collins class submarines for quite some time, and has been on a lookout for submarines to replace them in due course. So in 2016, they signed a deal with France for purchase of 12 what was called the attack class, which was essentially a Barracuda class in which the nuclear propulsion was changed to conventional propulsion. Now, this deal was for an estimated sum of 50 billion Australian dollars, and the submarines deliveries were meant to be taken in due course. A couple of maybe around 4 or 5 years into this deal, on 15 September 2021, Australia made what was at that time an earth-shattering announcement of entering into an agreement with the United States and UK for 12 nuclear submarines at an eye-popping overall program price of 368 billion US dollars. Now, this announcement, as may be expected, was seen with shock and dismay by France. I happened to be visiting France probably just a couple of weeks after this announcement, and their anger was apparent. I mean, they referred to Britain as frenemies, that is, friends and enemies. I think their anger was more directed against Australia and UK than against the United States. But be that as it may, the deal is now rolling. So let me just mention what are the broad parameters of AUKUS. It's in two pillars, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which Admiral Shrikhande will tell us about a lot more in detail. But insofar as Pillar 1 is concerned, that's about nuclear submarines. It essentially requires the setting up of a submarine rotational force west in naval base in the Her Majesty's Australian Naval Base Stirling in Western Australia by early 2027, in which there's going to be the rotational presence of one UK Astute class submarine and 4 Virginia class submarines. Starting in 2032, the delivery of 3 Virginia class submarines will take place, spaced out at 3-year intervals. There is provision for 2 more Virginia class to be delivered in case the AUKUS submarine is delayed. Late 2030s, Australia will accept the first SSN AUKUS, which will be built in the United Kingdom by BAE. And in early 2040s, the expectation is that they will start constructing their own submarines. So these are the broad parameters. So let me ask Admiral Shrikhande if you can tell us a little more about the overall program and what are the implications.
Yeah, Monty. I mean, you're right in explaining the suddenness of this decision. It transpired that it was amongst a very close group. Canberra itself. It caught most Australians by surprise, including military people, except for very senior leadership. and a few people in the cabinet and a few people in the opposition who were also co-opted. So from the beginning of the announcement, it did seem as if, it was a bipartisan uh, approach
Right.
that they took, and that element sort of continues to date, although there are tensions about that. We could discuss that later. So it was quite an irony that Australia had always sort of opposed nuclear attack, nuclear propulsion, nuclear power,
Nuclear
and
weapons, of course.
nuclear weapons, of course, that it still does, not to be Australian owned, but it also had similar stands on nuclear propulsion as well as nuclear power generation, which they said Australia doesn't need, cannot afford, does not want. And therefore, this announcement came as a surprise. And as you mentioned, it was quite ironic that that a nuclear basic nuclear design of the Suffren or what was then called the Barracuda, short fin Barracuda, was modified to a conventional for Australia's sake at great cost in terms of design, etc., and then cancelled overnight. So yes, the Australians were more than a little unhappy with that. We could discuss that part later. But the issue was that Australia had a problem with the Collins class, which they overcame. And today, the Collins class is still operational, but there are question marks on the ability to crew them. From the media, one can make out that sometimes there are not enough people available. So people will remain a challenge. They are trying to cope with that. But the other aspect about the Collins class also is that their age. So they are getting long in the tooth, and I think the first of the Collins will probably retire by 20 sometime in the 2030s,
Right.
when they would reach a 40-year lifespan. So they are also working on extensions now. So as a result, the problems I think in the Australian media that are being discussed is that the nuclear submarines still seem some distance away, and the conventional capability is declining with nothing to replace it. So that is the situation as far as the pillar one
Right.
consists of. Pillar two is about many other high technology defense accretions and cooperation. So in this case, Australia will cooperate more with the UK and the US in actually 8 areas. There are 8 working groups for this issue, which are really in quantum, in artificial intelligence, in hypersonics, counter hypersonics, advanced cyber operations, and also in terms of the innovation and information sharing. So those are likely to continue. In many ways, Australia has always depended on Pillar Two because of its small sort of capacity for defense R&D and technology. Although in many areas they are ramping up. So pillar two is you can say up and running in some ways, and pillar one is likely to happen. But as you mentioned, there might be some question marks on that.
So, if I could ask you a follow up on this, Pillar 2, one has been hearing about that Pillar 2 might be extended to some countries beyond AUKUS. And there's talk of Japan, sometimes talk of New Zealand. Do you see that happening of AUKUS expansion, at least in Pillar 2, if not Pillar 1?
Yes, I think uh, so. Which is why I mentioned that pillar two preceded AUKUS actually, and the whole idea of a pillar is somewhat sort of a bit foxing, because pillars are supposed to support
Right.
something. So you have two pillars, but what do they support? But nonetheless, that's the term that has come about. So yes, pillar two could have other partners. Japan has expressed interest. They went into something called JOCUS and things
Right.
like that, and there were some humorous comments about what these acronyms mean. But that apart, like you mentioned, France and Japan were the contenders for the conventional submarines,
Right.
which Japan lost out on and France won. So Pillar Two will certainly gather momentum, as it has to. Even India has a Pillar Two of sorts
Right.
with so many countries.
So, coming back to Pillar 1, I mean, Australia I mean, the decision to move from conventional to nuclear must have been quite a big decision for them, undoubtedly, especially for a country which has got no history, as you mentioned, and in fact, I would say had distanced themselves from anything nuclear. I mean, in the absence of a nuclear power industry, in the absence of along with that comes a whole certification process, organizations like we have AERB, etc. There's a lot that happens on the civil side, which you can leverage and which you can use towards
Absolutely.
your shipborne program. Uh, but for Australia, actually, if you see, given the distances involved in the Western Pacific, in a way, I would say nuclear submarines make sense. Conventional submarines will always be hard pressed, even with AIP, etc. AIP, as we discussed earlier, is good for remaining on patrol for prolonged durations, but is not the ideal platform for making long transits. And I think in a geographical context, Australia seems to be more in a place where it will be required to make prolonged transits, especially to get in closer towards the South China Sea or even the East China Sea in those areas, or even the Central Pacific and possibly the Indian Ocean also. So in that sense, I would say it is from an Australian point of view, it makes sense. But I mean, Australia's track record, particularly when it came to India acquiring our first nuclear submarine, was quite checkered, I would say. And would you like to comment on that, and also what the general position of countries in the neighborhood has been regarding Australia acquiring this capability?
Yeah. So, yes, you're right about that. Here's what I would like to say about SSNs, nuclear attack submarines, is that for a country to build, own, and operate nuclear attack submarines is excellent. For a country to have friends and partners who operate nuclear attack submarines is good and helpful. Uh, and for countries to have adversaries who build, operate nuclear attack submarines is not great news. So that's how important attack submarines are. And you're absolutely right that uh, Australia's geography or India's geography, in fact, the US's geography, Russia's geography, China's, make the role of nuclear attack submarines across naval conditions and missions very, very important. And these include sea control, sea denial, and power projection. So they are very important. And I think Australia uh, made perhaps the right decisions to go nuclear, all of a sudden on 15 September 2021. So as I mentioned somewhere, that announcement was probably more impactful than the Nautilus's signal of underway on nuclear power. So, and yet that aside, there are two or three other aspects which the viewers would perhaps be interested in, and that is that initial reactions were mixed, and they still do. There are some nations in the ASEAN group which have expressed reservations about Australia having nuclear submarines. Some of them have toned down their reservations, and they are more inclined to see the virtues of having these nuclear submarines as some kind of a counterbalance to China. China, of course, continues to criticize the program, which is to be expected. It's another way of looking at it that what worries China uh, might be actually working towards some element of counterbalancing. The other aspect is that India has always been neutral about it in the official pronouncements. We have never made any anti-Aukus statements, and I think privately, probably the establishment
Feels it's net positive, I think so.
feels comfortable
Yes,
with
sir.
the idea of Australia as a defense partner, especially in the maritime domain, where there are clear now chart navigation plans, you could say, for us to move forward. But so here is where the irony comes in, because in 1988 there's a very nice story from the India Today of February 1988, when a group of Australian media persons, people asked a senior Indian diplomat that Australia views uh, our first leased attack submarine Chakra, which came from the Soviet Union, I think in the late 80s, and the accompanying, Tu-142
MR
long range anti-submarine warfare patrol aircraft. We see it as a possible threat to Australia. So I'll just read out. He said, yes, indeed, we do have designs on you, but only in cricket. What else did you expect after you landed on Indian soil and whisked away the Reliance Cup? So it now, of course, that's water under the bridge. Our relationship has developed and evolved a great deal, and there are areas in which we can cooperate. And this brings me, and we can talk about it later.
Right.
And you mentioned it earlier. Is the difference between India's approach to nuclear propulsion and Australia's approach? There are some difficulties, like you mentioned. Australia does not really have a nuclear
Industry at all, yeah.
industry, a nuclear civilian establishment, and that is unique. And now they want to build it, and it's proving to be a big challenge. But they are coping with it. They're looking at training naval personnel is perhaps one of the simpler tasks, because many nations, India or the US or Russia or China, have nuclear propulsion training pipelines, and people can be co-opted into that, and come out professionally capable, confident to do that. And that's what the Australians are doing. But the civilian nuclear, they don't have civilian nuclear power. They do not have much of a civilian nuclear scientific and engineering community working in Australia. But they'll probably have to develop that if they have to, sustain the reactor programs in terms of maintenance, etc. They may not build reactors themselves. It doesn't look like they will. But even so, they will have to do that. And that's where I think in India, we've done very well. We've made slow progress, but it's Indian progress. And it is we are actually sovereign ready, which is one of the sort of labels in the Aukus optimal pathway to be sovereign ready to operate nuclear submarines. So we began, fairly sovereign ready, and therefore the road will be easier for India, even if it's been a long one.
So I think in this respect, one advantage, of course, that Australia will have is that with the Virginia class, they will get top of the line technology on the American side, and at least with the life of core reactors, you're saved with the issues of refueling, etc. All that is dispensed with because of the long life of these reactors. But there are certain risks which are associated from the US side. So let me just mention a few of them. The US, as we know, their submarine building program is under stress right now. During the Cold War, they had 7 yards that were building nuclear submarines. Now they've whittled down to just two. That's Electric Boat and Newport News. These are the only two that they are left with. Then along came COVID, where there was mass scale disruption. And they seem to be still reeling from the after effects of COVID because, the workforce whittled down in various places, etc., which they're trying to stand up at great cost. They now have a huge backlog for making submarines, and their requirement is to ramp up production to 2.3 per year, Virginia class. And what they're doing right now is 1.2. So it's a large gap from 1.2 to take it up to 3.3, 2.3. And on top of that is the Columbia class, the SSBN program which they have. So that is running concurrently, which the hope is that they will be able to generate at least one boat per year. The amount of work involved in building a Columbia class is, they say, 2.5 times that of a Virginia class because of the complexity of the design. Also, the Block 5 Virginia class is 30% larger than the Block 4. So as you're moving ahead, the amount of work required to generate newer submarines is going to be a lot more than what it is right now. For AUKUS, the US president must certify to Congress 270 days before any sale or transfer of a Virginia class that it will not degrade US undersea capabilities. They've not said it will not. So degrade undersea US capabilities. I think this phrase has been deliberately gives you some flexibility.
That's right.
in playing around with it. But in the last 5 years, between 2020 and 2024, only 6 Virginia-class submarines have been commissioned. That gives you a rate of 1.2 per year, and they have to go up to 2.3. So there's a 1.3 gap. What's more is that the Los Angeles class are approaching their end of their lifetime. Uh, in fact, by the time the delivery schedule of the Virginias to Australia starts, there'll be hardly 7 to 8 Los Angeles class submarines left. So, by some statistics, uh, under a best case scenario in 2032, when the first Virginia classes are meant to be delivered, uh, out of a requirement to have 66 attack submarines, the US, at best, will be left with 42 attack submarines. Which is a 36% shortfall, and it could be worse than that.
Yeah.
So it's going to be pretty difficult for the US, to meet their own requirement and the Australian requirement. And I think the first person to spell this out in quite clear terms is the newly appointed Undersecretary of Defense, that's Eldridge Colby, where he's not said that they will not provide it, but he's at least flagged the difficulties in moving ahead with the program. Insofar as UK is concerned, the problems for the delivery of the Aukus submarines, of the SSN Aukus, are also acute. I mean, there right now they have to deliver 2 more Astute class submarines. And then the Dreadnought class, which is going to be their replacement SSBN program, is priority number 1 for them. So they are going to anticipate delays, in which case, whether it becomes 3+2, the 2 additional submarines of Virginia class, whether they'll kick in or not, I mean, these are all imponderables right now. So I just thought, given all this, does Australia have a plan B?
There are two strands of Plan B. One has come from the US, which says in Plan B, let's just bolster Pillar 2. That's Plan B. But in Australia, there are veterans, strategists who are saying that we need to look at Plan B in a different way. Some of them feel that we should just drop the idea of SSNs, but there are others who are saying that perhaps we should go back to the French and ask and buy up to 12 Soufrian class, or the same ones that they had rejected, which the French have started building.
This is nuclear
Propulsion, SSNs.
Okay.
So that's what they're doing. But here I would like to then ask you, that given constraints that the Americans and the British face, with the slow production rate, and it's likewise for, say, India also, with our nuclear propulsion program. Do you think the French have the industrial capacity? Should uh, the Australians make a reciprocal, a complete course change and go back to France? Do you think some of the problems that you spelt out for the American shipbuilding industry and for the British, would that really be very different from the French? And would there be challenges of IPR as far as even the French are concerned, something that would challenge the Australians?
So I think, insofar as France is concerned, I mean, any country to churn out, another 12 boats over a time frame of, let's say, 25, 30 years, is, while meeting your own requirements, is going to be not an easy task. Let's put it that way. And the French again have got only 1 yard in Cherbourg.
Sure.
So for them to meet their own requirements, I mean, okay, let's assume that the Barracuda class, draws to a conclusion at some stage. There will be requirements for a replacement for the SSBNs in due course.
Yes.
So they'll have to again manage both these classes and see. I'm sure they will find ways and means to, I would say, to optimize. But I have my doubts whether they can meet an aggressive delivery schedule, which the Australians may have in mind. So they might have to, either reduce the numbers or string them along for a longer period, to do that. But I think, in terms of IPR, I think the French are better positioned. Because the US tends to often tie themselves in knots, with their own regulatory framework, particularly for nuclear submarines, which they regard as the holy grail. For them, this is the ultimate in technology, which their the protective measures that they have introduced are extreme. But that being said, I mean, they have bent over backwards to quite an extent to ease these IPR regulations to meet Aukus requirements.
Yes.
So they have made a large internal sort of legislation which they have enacted, or if not enacted, at least have put in place to support the Aukus program in that sense. In continuation with this, I mean, you have to give it to the Americans that they have done a lot to support AUKUS on their own way. And let me just name a few of the actions that they've taken. Training in nuclear propulsion school for Australians has been instituted, I think, for the last couple of years at least. Australian officers today are embedded in US Navy attack submarines. And I think it's a Virginia also, but certainly in the Los Angeles class. We recently had the USS Los Angeles that pulled into Sterling, and along with her was the submarine tender, the Emery S. Land.
Yes.
And she did a sort of a maintenance program over there in which 30 Australian technicians were embedded as part of that program. 2025, you've already had, in February this year, that is, you've already had the first Virginia class USS Minnesota, which has come into Sterling again and done a turnaround over there. So, in a very phased manner, I would say they're proceeding in this respect. So, while on one side the delivery might, is looking difficult, but they seem to be not letting it impact the run up to the delivery, at least at this stage, which I think shows their commitment to their program. So I think a lot is happening over here, but it'll be interesting to see how it all finally pans out. I mean, at the end of the day, uh, I don't know whether there's going to be a fresh decision point at some stage, or whether iteratively they'll keep resolving these issues and maybe either adjust the timelines or phase it out further. Or what, do you have any views on this?
I think the Australians will probably persist with AUKUS as it stands now, and even if currently they feel that there might be temporary setbacks or temporary changes of views in Washington D.C., one way they might be looking at it is that the temporary nature of these views might finish in another 4 years.
Okay, with the change in administration.
With a change in administration. So we don't know what might happen at that time. But you're right. The Americans have supported this, just like they supported the British nuclear propulsion and ICBM programs, the Polaris programs in the 60s. So it's likely to go further. Why I feel Plan B may not work out is because AUKUS itself turned out to be Plan B in 2021 September. And that didn't go well with the French.
So you're looking at Plan C now.
Now, if Plan B virtually, in reality, Plan C goes back to the French, there'll be now, instead of one unhappy country, there'll be two unhappy countries. So that is. So I think it seems unlikely that Plan B, as is being spoken about, is likely to happen, because that also creates, as you mentioned, new uncertainties. So the current uncertainties are likely to be overcome. But if Plan B or Plan C, choose what you will, happens, then we will have new issues coming up, and that would also create a lot of turmoil. So while nothing can be ruled out, I feel Australians will probably stay the course now with AUKUS.
And I would think one demonstration of that has been, I think, just last week. Was it the first or the second installment of the $3 billion they have to pay
Yes.
for the, for strengthening US shipyards to meet this requirement? The installment of $500 million was paid.
That's right.
And I think Hexet said the check was cashed. So
Yes.
so
That's right.
so it seems that they are moving ahead. But while I'm not too sure, on policy uncertainties, I doubt that will happen. The main risk to the program, I think, is on production uncertainty.
Yes,
I think that's
right.
that is the biggest issue.
Yes.
That
What you mentioned about the production rates and the requirements of SSNs, which is very right. That's actually the critical consideration.
Right. But I mean, all said and done, in a sense that because the US and Australia are allies, even if they hand over submarines, their tasking would be sort of shared.
Yes.
So I think from an employment standpoint, I mean, whether they fly with an Australian flag or whether they fly with a US flag, whether they sail with a with a US flag and Australian flag, the overall employment when it comes will be quite coordinated in that respect. So there might be some issues regarding command and control, etc. But given the close nature of this relationship, they might be. I'm pretty sure they'll be able to overcome that.
Yes, that seems very likely that they'll find a way. It may not be optimal a pathway as one of the documents is called, but it will still be a pathway. And in all this, I think one larger issue that keeps coming back to my mind is that perfect is always the enemy of good enough. And in trying to aim for perfection in defense hardware, we sometimes keep kicking the ball down the street, because perfection is very hard to define, but something good enough is easier to sense and feel and accept.
But
So
in that sense, I think Australia seems to have may have learned their lesson to some extent. The Collins class was a new design,
yes,
which they did, and the attack class was a new design. So I think here they've decided to go at least for a proven design.
that's
That
right.
is, I'm not about the Aukus SSN. I think that's
Yes.
going to be new, but at least for the Virginia class, which is a proven design. So that being said, sir, could I ask you to sort of sum up today's discussion?
That nuclear attack submarines are very important for sea power itself. They they are critical for sea control. They're critical for power projection with their land attack missile capabilities, and they're critical for sea denial and combinations of these as conditions entail. It's a long, hard road. It requires a lot of national skills. It requires dedicated human potential and resources, and it's tough training. And the key will be for Australia is to retain the people they've trained as they go along, and to keep the training pipeline going. Um, what may happen is that the load on Australian defense budgets because of the SSNs may itself be very high. And one of the problems I would say is that the the term strategic and the term deterrence have been a bit too loosely used for many acquisitions, including for nuclear attack submarines. So deterrence is probably more relevant to SSBNs, but that's also for nuclear deterrence. Um, an SSN by itself, is not a huge component of deterrence, but it's an important component of the framework of deterrence that any nation or partnerships can field. So if in the media also, we throttle back a little bit from overinterpreting and overusing the term strategic as a prefix, and saying nuclear attack submarines are strategic, because you have to employ them strategically.
Right.
By itself, a platform is not
Strategic
is,
indeed.
is not strategic by itself. But there will be challenges, and all nations, including ours, it's been a long road, hard road. Um, at sea, you cannot say bumpy but choppy, certainly. And but we have to persist, and I think India has also done well in her own way to persist with that road. And I think Australia also might find their own way.
So it remains for me to thank Admiral Shrikhande and to thank all of you for taking the time out and listening to us. And always delightful to have this conversation. And once again, if I could remind you to hit the subscribe button, and we will come out with our next episode shortly. Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
luck and God bless.
Bye.